What's up everyone, welcome to our tutorial on drawing sprites. Here we'll get a quick intro into what sprites are from a game context and how to create and use them in SFML. So this is actually a two-step process. The first thing we need to do is create a texture object. Once we have that, we can create a sprite from it, and then we can set the position and the scale. So let's head to the code and get started. Alright, so just a quick heads up again, I took all the code from the previous section, not that we really did very much, and put it in old code, and I'll continue to do this with each new section. Alright, so what is a sprite from a game context? Well, essentially, a sprite is going to be an object in the game that has an image associated with it. So this is really the main difference between, let's say, shapes and sprites in games, is that a sprite has an image, and a shape just has, well, a shape. It just has its boundaries, it has some sort of code to dictate what shape those boundaries will take on, be it a circle, square, rectangle, etc. So in our case, the background of our game and the enemy itself, those are both going to be sprites. We're not really going to be working with shapes very much. So like I said, this is a two-step process. The first thing we need to do is load in a texture, and a texture needs an image to load. So that's why I had you load in your assets folder. So your project should look like this, SFML project, you have your codes, and then you have your assets folder with the items in it. We'll use the TTF as a font later on, same with the damage.ogg, that's for sound. For now, we'll at least want the Enemy.png because that's what we're going to be working with here. Okay, so as long as we have it in our project assets / enemy.png, then we can load it in like this. Okay, first thing that we'll need to do is create a texture itself. So we'll do sf texture. Okay, now a texture, just like the render window, is part of the SFML graphics library. Anytime you need a new module, you'll need to load it in here. Okay, so we have a texture object. We actually don't need to call a constructor, set it equal to a texture, anything like that. Once we create the object, we have access to it immediately. And we need to call the loadFromFile function like this. Texture.loadFromFile. Oops, not loadFromStream, we want loadFromFile. Okay, and then we're going to pass in the path to the file. So in this case, this is going to be assets / enemy.png. Now this is actually going to return true or false based on the success or failure. So we're going to say something like if we'll say if not texture.loadFromFile, then maybe we'll just print out some message and return. So let's just close that off, and this should actually be in here. Okay, so in this case what we can do is something like standard cout. Actually, don't think we have the IOStream library, so I'm just going to include that now. Include IOStream. Okay, good stuff. Okay, so now we'll do a cout, something like could not load enemy texture. Okay, and then we're just going to end it. All right. And because we really want the game to only run if the texture is loaded, we're actually going to return false. Cool, so as long as this is the case, oh actually, you know what this is returning? We'll return 0. Okay, so as long as the texture is loaded, so as long as this doesn't return 0, then we have a texture, rather an image loaded into this texture, and now we can use it with a sprite. So to do that, we'll do basically the same process as with a texture. We need to create the sprite object first, sprite, and we'll call this like enemy sprite or something. Okay, and then we're going to call upon the enemy sprite dot set texture function, and then we're just going to pass in the texture that we loaded. Okay, so this will associate a texture with the sprite. So now the sprite is created, it has a texture, and we can draw it. We don't know exactly what size or position, well, we do know what position it will be in, which will be 0, 0 by default, which will be upper left corner, and the size will be exactly the size of the image itself. We can modify that later on, which we'll do in just a minute here. Okay, so just using the default values, if we want to draw this to the window, we simply call upon the window.draw and then pass in the sprite. So in this case, enemy sprite. Okay, cool. So we'll give this a save, and let's run the code and see what happens. So we'll clear it, let's compile it, and then let's run it. And now you can see that we have this little sprite in our game. Obviously, there are some issues here. It's getting cut off, so the screen's not big enough to begin with. Also, this is kind of in the top left corner. We might not want it there, and it might not be quite big enough. Okay, so that's all stuff that we can adjust. Maybe let's do a 500 by 500 window. That way we have enough size to draw most of the things that we need. Then, if we go to rerun it, we should probably see that it's not going to take up the whole screen anymore, it's just taking up a part of it. So maybe we don't want it in the top left, maybe we want it kind of a bit centered. So what we can do is maybe move it about 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down, might put it roughly in the center. Okay. So what we can do is take this enemy sprite, okay, and we can set the position of it. So this is going to take in a vector2f object like this, SF vector 2f, which will take in a vector two-dimensional float, and this will need a width and a height, or an x and y value. So in this case, we'll just do 100 and 100. Okay, if we go to, let's close this up, if we go to rerun it. Okay, so we'll recompile it. Again, every time you make a change, you have to recompile it. You can see that this is now moved. We can also change the height. Let's kind of make this guy a little bit taller, but we won't necessarily change the width of it. So what we can do is just close that up, do the enemy sprite dot, and we can scale it. Okay, weirdly enough, you can't assign a specific width and height. You actually have to scale things. Okay, so in this case, we're going to again pass in a vector2f. Capital V, vector 2f, okay, and then we're going to pass in the amount by which we want to scale the x and the amount by which we want to scale the y. So the x is going to remain exactly the same, so we'll just do 1. The y, however, we want to change the height. Maybe we'll do like a 1.5 and see how that works out. Okay, so we'll go back to here. Well, I guess we don't need to clear it. We'll just kind of recompile and we'll rerun it, and now you can see that this guy is horribly stretched, but at least the scaling worked. Now, there are plenty of other things that we can do with sprites, but this will be pretty much the extent of what we're going to do in this course with our sprites. One last thing to note before moving on to the next section is that the sprite's bounding box is actually this whole rectangle. Weirdly enough, the bounding box doesn't follow the image like this. This is going to be the bounding box. So when it comes to detecting mouse clicks on this guy, even if you click up here, it's technically within the bounding box, so that's going to register a click. Okay, we'll get more into that a little bit later on, just wanted to make you guys aware now. Okay, we'll close this up, otherwise that's it. So in this section we covered two things, loading in textures, and the second, creating sprites and setting their attributes. Definitely feel free to play around with this, maybe try to load in your background, see how well you can do with that. When you're ready to move on, we'll do pretty much the same thing, but with text. So stay tuned for that, thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next one.